Well, it looks like we're going to have very thin lecture attendance on this Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Um, it's always very risky having a lecture on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, given the number of people who are gone. Um, Making it a live Zoom lecture has both pluses and minuses. Um, it's interesting that the minus kind of appears to dominate or appears to be dominating um, right now relative to other things. So I suppose first to check in anything on anyone's mind in particular. How are the papers going? How does the forthcoming holiday look? Or are people
Um,
still yes?
Sorry, Professor Gilo. I have an appointment last week, but I did not see you. I did not have chance to see you. I'm wondering if I could talk about my paper after class by any chance.
Um if you come back at 5:15, yes. At 5 o'clock, there are other people have already grabbed that slot. But come back at 5:15, and that should work well.
Okay, great. Thank you so
All right.
much. Thank you.
Okay. Mhm. All right. Um, Anything else of note happening to people? Other than me catching a cold and then failing my symptom screener. And although I got a negative COVID test on the home kit, that's not good enough for them. And, my results for the non home kit are still not back. Um, Therefore, I'm still supposedly banned from campus, at least until those tests get back and get our negative. Okay, then, well, I might as well get started talking about reglobalization, information technology, and hyperglobalization, 1950 to 2007. Say. The first during the age of social democracy and then during the age of neoliberalism, the reknitting of the global economy and its extension to an extraordinary degree, plus the coming of the latest of the leading sectors of the general purpose technologies, information technology. And how all these things led people by 2007 to conclude that, by and large, neoliberalism was working, or at least it could have been working, or at least it was working for the relatively rich. Um, all these things that were going on alongside the great neoliberal turn. Um, and indeed, the neoliberal turn was all but complete by 2000, say. Um, and four factors determined its course. First, reglobalization, the fact that the pre World War I international division of labor was reestablished and that joining the world market seemed to be a substantial plus for a growing economy. Second, an extraordinary innovation and its deployment in goods transport, containerization. No longer did goods have to be unpacked from a ship, carried to shore, and then reloaded into whatever container they were going in, but the same containers would carry the goods from its original packing at the factory all the way to its final unpacking at the distribution sector. Um, Making the profession of longshoreman all of a sudden an extraordinarily um, shrink, rapidly shrinking one, and making the costs of ocean transport, which had been cheap since the iron hulled, screw propellered ocean going steamship, absolutely trivial, making each port in the world, as long as it had a container port, effectively right next door. Um, and then there was informationalization, the fact that you could transmit information very thick bandwidth across the globe using audiovisual technologies. And these last two produced hyperglobalization. And then there were the effects of neoliberal policies themselves, which I would say did little to spur economic growth, except where they helped dismantle counterproductive rent-seeking entrenched interest groups in places where neoliberalism did provide an excuse to dismantle such. And other than that, they simply enriched the rich, not just their economic, but their political power. And it is somewhat of a puzzle that the neoliberal turn was not only made in 1980, but that its difficulties during the 1980s did not lead to a reversal. Its ascent to dominance and its maintenance of dominance in spite of its policy failures. Well, I seem to see three things going on that might have been decisive, that might have been important. One was that neoliberalism was able to claim credit for victory in the Cold War, and that also claim credit for rapid growth in China and a little bit later in India. Second, that neoliberalism dealt with the itch that the egalitarian age of social democracy and universal benefits had produced, and that neoliberalism claimed it kept the unworthy from getting more than they deserved, and that was very, very popular, at least among those who thought of themselves as worthy. And it also generated the income and wealth inequality that allowed the rich to purchase megaphones to saying that everything is fine and in fact great. This is Thomas Piketty's argument that the natural state of a market economy is an unequal income distribution, and the natural state of even a democracy with an unequal income distribution is that the tide of information and propaganda written for and by the rich drowns out more egalitarian voices in the public sphere, except during relatively unique moments, like the age of catastrophe from 1914 to 1945, and like the age of extraordinarily rapid catch-up growth in Western Europe and of strong unions in the United States from 1945 to 1975. But, not think that hyperglobalization, that information technology, that reglobalization rebounded after the end of the age of social democracy. That redounded to the benefit of everyone, or of nearly everyone, even in the global north. Bosses and engineers now found they could put their factories elsewhere in the world than in the global north, and this greatly eroded the bargaining power of global north workers located near old industrial sectors. So deindustrialization spread from the global south into pieces of the New York. But on the other hand, those who owned valuable property were much more able to benefit from it as the neoliberal age proceeded. Look at the rich portions of the United States right now. What you see is New England, you see Los Angeles County, Northern California, and then Oregon from Portland up to Washington. You see Denver and associated other areas of Colorado, and Minneapolis and associated areas of Minnesota. You see Chicago. And then you see the oil and natural gas patches of Wyoming, of North Dakota, and of Texas. You see the coal patch of West Virginia, and be assured that the benefits of that did not flow to the majority of people living there. And then you see Washington, D.C. and environs as the place where you go to lobby and where income redistribution and rent seeking are taking place. So a quilted arrangement in the global north and in the global south as well. Some gained absolutely massively. Others did not gain at all. Still others lost. It did mean that people and regions that had thought that Polanyian rights were not their problem, that they had stable sound and good bargaining positions in the global economy, suddenly found that it was not so for their regions, or at least it was not so for them in their regions. And so there always was, during the process of reglobalization, infotech, and then hyperglobalization, growing worries that the creative destruction is working against us. But infotech produced a rapid but temporary restoration of rapid growth in the 1990s and early 2000s in the global north. And perhaps the rapid infotech growth was even more rapid. That is, our standard measures of national product. They are factor cost. They are how much it costs in terms of resources to produce things. And where productivity is guessed at by saying how much more cheaply in terms of resources can we this year make this same thing we made last year. But what we really care about is not factor cost, but rather user benefit. Factor cost plus consumer plus user surplus. And we have very little handle of that at all. I believe it was Harvard's Robert Barrow who said that when you have a physical good, you can kind of expect that consumer surplus is going to be about equal on average to factor cost. But when you get to information goods, where you get to write once, read everywhere, where you get to things that have only virtual existence, and where a single produced example can satisfy everyone, well, first, the price of it will be much lower than if it were a physical good, because it's so hard to keep intellectual property from leaking out legally and from being pirated illegally. So perhaps it would be better to say that when you have an information good, that the consumer surplus is 5 or 10 times what the factor cost is. And then even our today anemic rate of growth of measured productivity, expressed as factor cost, international income, and product accounts, that may well support an enormous increase in the human empire as perceived by consumers, at least as perceived by consumers, who like to stare at their phones for quite a while. And now that we have a new dog, we've discovered we must like to stare at our phones a great deal, because there is nothing the dog likes to do more than find someone's phone, grab it in his jaws, and then take it someplace on the floor and lie down in front of it, holding in his paws and looking at it. Before then, he starts to gnaw on it with his teeth, and it has to go to the My Emergency Guy iPhone repair place. As of 2007, lots of neoliberal patting themselves on the back. But indeed, in the old Greek narrative pattern, hubris was indeed to bring forth eventually nemesis.